Salvatore Babones has become quite a popular voice in India, especially amongst speaking tours, the academics, the intelligentsia. He's an associate professor at the University of Sydney, and he's out with a new article titled Unholy Alliance Inside the Activist Campaign to Pry India from the West. Salvatore Babones is joining us live and exclusively first here on CNN News 18. Salvatore, thanks a lot for coming in. And first, I want to begin by asking you, you've become quite a celebrity in India. How does that feel? You've been invited to, several events, speaking engagements. You've traveled a few cities now in India. How has your time been?
Look, it's been a pleasure, and the best part has been meeting people. Being on TV is a lot of fun, but the best part of it is that because you've been on television, then ordinary people recognize you, want to say hello, want to talk. And for me as a sociologist, it's been invaluable to have just that opportunity to meet people because they think they're familiar with me, they know me somehow, and it really has been wonderful.
There are a lot of people who, obviously like you, like what you say about India, the perspective that you bring on how India is being seen globally. But I think there are equal number of people who don't possibly like you that much because you're almost busting a narrative.
Well, if anyone doesn't like me, I haven't noticed because I've been received with really such open arms. But yes, I know, look, there must be people who resent being challenged with a narrative that they've monopolized for a long time. And I think Western knowledge of India has been monopolized by really just a half dozen people, columnists and intellectuals with access to Western media who've shaped the entire Western understanding of the country. And
that understanding is faulty, you would say?
I think it's not only faulty, it's largely false. That is, the quantitative data we have suggest a very different India from the qualitative understandings that we've received from this small group of journalists and intellectuals.
Before I get to your paper, Unholy Alliance Inside the Activist Campaign to Pry India from the West, I just want to take that point further. Do you believe that false analysis, the qualitative analysis in the hands of a few half a dozen people and columnists overseas, is that a recent trend or has that existed? Because a lot of people believe that's predominantly anti-Modi activism.
I think it is mostly anti-Modi activism, but it's anti-Modi activism that has been translated into anti-India or anti-democracy narratives. That is, instead of challenging the government, they're challenging the state. We see that, for example, in challenging the independence of the Electoral Commission of India. Now, I've seen very little in India that suggests that the Electoral Commission has been compromised in any way. Yet the international narrative we've heard is the Electoral Commission has gone from being fully independent just 8 or 10 years ago to now being in the pocket of the government today. Now, I doubt that narrative is true, but that's what we hear. People are taking their personal subjective opinions and presenting it as objective fact.
Can I just ask you, you're coming to India, you've been in India at a time when George Soros's comments have been in the news. I'm sure you're aware of what he has said, not for the first time. But do you believe his comments, as they're being received, truly do blow the whistle on exactly what we've been talking about? That there is this group of individuals, including Indians, who are shaping
almost
this
exclusively
almost
Indians.
Exclusively Indians, you believe, who are shaping this narrative because many believe that George Soros doesn't even know much about India. What he's saying and what he believes about India and very little democracy in India is actually a narrative fed to him.
Look, I doubt George Soros knows much about Indian democracy, but he does know what he reads in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, which is then presented as factual accounts of Indian democracy. Yet those accounts are coming, again, I keep stressing this, from a very small number of primarily South Asian, primarily Indian voices who have very strongly held opinions on India. Now, I don't doubt the sincerity of those opinions that are being reported in these newspapers, but they come to be presented as fact to the rest of the world. And because we have no other source of information on India, we take it seriously. I mean, when you hear someone call American democracy now being a fascist dictatorship, the Republicans are fascists, the Democrats are fascists, you shrug your shoulders because you're very familiar with American democracy. You can make your own decisions. When a Westerner sees India called fascist in the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times, We take that seriously because we know very little about India. We have very little depth of knowledge. Most Americans couldn't name a single Indian leader, not even Narendra Modi. Those who could name Narendra Modi couldn't name a second one. Now, I challenge your viewers, almost every one of them could not only name Joe Biden, but could name the last 3 presidents of the United States and could probably name at least 2 or 3 governors and cabinet secretaries in the United States. Your knowledge of America is so deep, it's so deep that you're not swayed by these sorts of ridiculous statements about American democracy. But our knowledge of India is so shallow that if all we hear are these complaints, we take them seriously.
George Soros believes that there's a Hindu nationalist government under Narendra Modi in India, and he has in the past expressed his view that, he wants this government out. I want to understand from you, and I think there are shades of this in your new paper, in your new article, that Hindu nationalism has been almost equated with fascism, with Nazism. Hindutva today is equated with Nazism. And there's very little proof to show that they're actually alike. Why do you think that is happening? And where is this coming from? Why are Hindu nationalists treated with such suspicion?
There's nothing in common between Hindutva and Nazism, and I think you can see that when you see what else is also compared to Nazism. We routinely see Zionism, that is Jews' desire to return to Israel, as a form of Nazism or fascism. And that, of course, is absolutely ridiculous. The Nazi regime was as anti-Semitic, committed an anti-Semitic genocide. We see these terms thrown around because they're very emotional terms, and people want to associate things they disagree with in these emotional connections to absolute evil. Of course, this is pure rhetoric. But again, I stress to an American who knows nothing about India, this pure rhetoric becomes all that person knows about India, and that's why this is causing such problems. Now, let's be honest, the current government of India is strongly, deeply nationalistic, just as every government in the United States is deeply nationalistic, just as every major political party in India is nationalistic, and the current party is closely associated with Hinduism, just as every major political party in India is closely associated with Hinduism. So there's nothing, you can call it Hindu nationalist. I prefer not to put that label on it, but is it a is it a government that's Hindu in orientation? Yes. Is it a government that's nationalist in orientation? Yes. But I stress to Indians who may oppose the current government that someday if Congress comes back to power, Congress will be a Hindu-oriented government that will be highly nationalist. And if Indians accept this vilification of Hinduism and nationalism, they'll find this vilification sticks even when the BJP is gone.
Interestingly, what you also say in your paper is that there is a form of, as you said, anti-Zionism, anti-Hinduism that is being masked as anti-Hindutva activism. Because Hindutva is bad. We are not opposing Hinduism, we are opposing Hindutva. That's an argument we've heard from academics all around. In fact, there are organizations, academic organizations and groups in the US that hold seminars like Dismantle Global Hindutva. And the front is that this is against Hindutva. This is not against Hindus and Hinduism per se. Do you believe that is the truth?
Yeah, we've seen this playbook before. So in Western academia, there's a very strong strain of anti-Semitism. But after World War II, you couldn't be publicly anti-Semitic. So instead, this was translated into anti-Zionism. It's the same people, the same organizations, the same departments of the same universities that used to be openly anti-Semitic. They're now anti-Zionist. Well, now we're seeing those same elite institutions becoming anti-Hindutva. They can't be openly anti-Hindu, but they can be anti-Hindutva. And I think that anti-Hindutva message is simply the polite face of anti-Hinduism. And it's the same playbook as with anti-Zionism. Because you can't tell which anti-Zionists are really anti-Semites, you can say I'm anti-Zionist and get away with it. Because you can't tell which anti-Hindutva activists are really just anti-Hindu, you can say it and get away with it. But I think when you look at it, and you look at the people who are so vehemently anti-Hindutva, and you ask, why are you elite white American professor who has, or elite white British intellectual who have no connection with India, why are you so viscerally anti-Hindutva? And I can only trace it to the historical anti-Hinduism, which we know was historically present. All you have to do is look at the way Winston Churchill talked about Mahatma Gandhi to see this anti-Hinduism, this anti-Hindu bias among the elite upper crust in America and the United Kingdom. Well, they can't say they're anti-Hindu anymore, so they found a new way to say it.
Do you believe that the world globally is beginning to look at this in the manner that you see it, or there is a lobby that is, very deeply protecting this form of new anti-Hinduism?
There are, of course, Hindu civil society organizations in the U.S. The Coalition of Hindus in North America and the Hindu American Foundation. They're trying to fight these efforts, but I think that they're up against a very strong opponent. Dr. Rajiv Malhotra has written quite a bit about this. They're up against an intellectual establishment that has been viscerally anti-Hindu since the days of colonialism, that is well entrenched, that has access to the top institutions, the top newspapers, the top magazines and journals in American and British society. And it's very difficult to fight this trend in the academy when they have control of the institutions. I mean, I've heard people in India say that, the establishment, the famous phrase, they're in government, we control the establishment. I don't know how true that really is in India, but it's very much true of the United States and United Kingdom.
I think people believe it's pretty much true in India. I mean, the global fight, which is the academia fight, is still very much true in India too, isn't it? That's what controls the narrative still today, and that's also what controls the history, for example. History is a huge battle.
I don't know how true it is, but the Oxbridge and Ivy League elite very much control the establishment in the United States and UK.
And their views are, the
among
views
many
which are
of them.
not...
I won't say every person, obviously not. But among those who have any view of India at all, they seem to be driven by a visceral dislike of Hinduism and just such an inexplicably strong desire to intervene in Indian politics when they have no real stake in the country.
Yeah. I'll come to what else you mentioned as far as your new article is concerned. It's a very deep read, and it's an interesting read about the nexus that is working, that usually succeeds in making India look bad when it comes to foreign coverage, but also importantly in research papers, in rankings, in perception indices, etc. But I do want to ask you, recently when we speak about Western narratives on India, we had this BBC documentary which was, eventually banned, not banned, but its circulation was curbed. And BBC eventually had some surveys of the Income Tax Department on its offices. Do you believe that does make India look bad, and it makes India look as thin-skinned, that it cannot take criticism? Because the obvious allegation was that this was because the BBC documentary showing Narendra Modi in very poor light over Gujarat riots came out.
Look, of course it makes India look bad. It makes it difficult to defend press freedom in India. That said, as far as I understand, this was all conducted in line with Indian law, and so India has its own laws and its own approach. But from a public relations standpoint and from a public diplomacy standpoint, it certainly would have been much better for the government to take the BBC documentary on the chin, argue against it, but to let it be shown in India. That certainly would have been a better move from the standpoint of public diplomacy. That said, everyone in India is political, so just as opposition to the BJP often drives this anti-India narrative in the West, the BJP's own electoral calculations seem to drive it towards positions that will make it look bad in the West. So I'm sure that from the BJP's perspective, attacking the BBC, probably they saw it as an opportunity for electoral gain.
But as far as the documentary in itself is concerned, since you believe that there is indeed a nexus that continuously works in showing India in poor light, the Gujarat riots are a prime example. 20 years after the riots, more than 20 years after the riots, 20 years after the Supreme Court has looked into it, Narendra Modi has been absolved of all charges of personal responsibility or collusion. Yet this documentary comes out 20 years later, mentions nothing about the Supreme Court verdict. Do you believe that is indeed propaganda and narrative and not quite reporting?
Well, it's not exactly anti-India propaganda. So this is what I talk about in the paper. This unholy alliance I speak of is a strange alliance between Christian missionaries, international Islamists, and the global human rights infrastructure, the human rights NGOs. So look at this documentary. It is all based on a report that came out of the British High Commission in 2002.
Which nobody saw, by the way.
That they haven't released, that was leaked. It was leaked, it seems, immediately after Rishi Sunak became the first Hindu Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I strongly suspect that that leak was motivated by anti-Hinduism, not by anti-India views. If it were anti-India or anti-Modi, it would have been leaked during the election campaign. Right? To leak it now strongly indicates that the minute it was leaked from the Foreign Service, and the Foreign Service in the UK, forgive me, I mean, I know this is all circumstantial evidence, but we have so many accounts that it's riddled with anti-Semitism and anti-Hinduism, and has been for 100 years. I mean, this is not something new. The Foreign Service in the UK, somebody in that organization, when Britain got its first Hindu prime minister, decided to leak something that would embarrass its Hindu prime minister and hopefully, and I think they were hoping, bring down the government in the UK.
Really? You think this was actually targeted pinpointedly at Rishi Sunak?
This is not about Modi, it's about Sunak. You have to ask, don't ask why did the BBC make the documentary.
Why
ask,
now?
why did the Foreign Office leak, why did someone in the Foreign Office leak the 2002 report? Okay, what was the motivation of the leaker? No leak, no documentary. Right. Now, given the leak, of course the BBC made a documentary. But why was it leaked in the first place? There is no reasonable explanation having to do with Narendra Modi or India for that leak from the... Why now, after 20 years? Why not leak it in 2019? Why not leak it in 2014?
But a lot of people also feel that it could be a precursor to what we're about to face, for example, ahead of the 2024 general elections. There's very little that people can do against Narendra Modi but for bring his image down, right? Also, I mentioned this because in that episode, for example, on Gujarat riots, if you had mentioned that Narendra Modi has faced legal scrutiny over what has been alleged against him for 20 years and has come out of it, you know, it could be seen that you're being non-partisan. But because it doesn't mention and because there's a more human rights approach to what has been shown, not so much about, you know, factual approach, it almost presented it as a one-sided story. Do you believe that that was not the intention?
No, look, all of our evidence is circumstantial. But I think it makes much more rational sense to see the leak of this 2002 report by somebody in the Foreign Office as much more connected to the violence in Leicester, the Hindu-Muslim violence in Leicester in England, and the arrival of a Hindu Prime Minister in England, in the United Kingdom, that this is a much more likely explanation. There's a strong Islamist bent within the Foreign Office in the UK, that Islamists inside the Foreign Office likely leaked this at this point for precisely the reason that this has become an issue in the UK. If it were targeted at India, it would have been leaked in 2014, in 2019, or in 2024.
Okay. So in your paper, you contend, in your article, you contend that Christian missionary and Islamist pressures are working behind the scenes in some of these reports we see over India, some of these rankings that routinely seem to be very terrible on India, and term India as anti-Muslim or, you know, anti-religious freedom or religious expression. Explain that. Why do you believe that there is a nexus behind these rankings?
Well, so first let me contextualize it. Genocide Watch, international NGO, rates India one of the 10 most likely countries to experience a genocide in the 2020s.
Wow.
They claim that there is a 8% chance that there will be a genocide in India in 2023. Now look around you in India. Is there likely to be a genocide? I don't think so.
I really don't think so.
But this narrative has been built and built and built. And a lot of it has to do with these international religious freedom reports produced by the U.S. State Department and particularly by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, which puts together these reports on international religious freedom. Now, the reports compiled by the State Department on India focused almost entirely on complaints made by Christian missionaries. Because if you think about it, if a Muslim in India feels she's facing discrimination, is she likely to go to the U.S. State Department to complain?
Unlikely.
Likely not. Okay. So of the hundreds of complaints made to the U.S. State Department about repression of religious freedom in India, fewer than 10, single-digit numbers, have to do with Muslims. 800 or more have to do with Christians.
Christians, yeah.
Okay.
And Christian missionaries.
It's all missionary related.
Yeah.
However, when the Pew Research Center did its international religious freedom rankings based on these reports, first, it rated India the worst country in the world. I'm emphasizing that. Worst in the world for social hostility to religion, meaning that people face more communal violence, more religious hostility in India than in Myanmar, which just had a genocide. I mean, the Rohingya were driven out of Myanmar. They're claiming the situation in India is worse than in Myanmar. That's all based on these U.S. State Department reports where all of the complaints are made by missionaries. Yet in their text narrative of their report, they only mention complaints
Against Muslims.
against Muslims.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're taking a raw data that says Christians are facing repression in India. They're then writing a report that says India is the worst in the world for religious repression, and it's repression against Muslims. And then that narrative gets taken up. So all of the reports based on this Pew Research Center ranking says Muslims face increasing repression in India. Just look, India's been named worst in the world for repression. Now, we know quantitatively, there's been very good research on this, that anti-Christian violence in India is extremely rare. Okay, and the leading researcher, quantitative researcher of this, has said that it's rarer than anti-Semitism in the United States. Okay, so it exists.
Despite India's vast population difference.
Well, in terms of per capita.
Okay.
So it exists in India, but it's very rare. So there are churches that have had vandalism on their church doors. We're not denying that. But it's rarer than synagogues in America
Being
facing, synagogues in America have been subject every 5 or 10 years to gun attacks. I mean, there's been very serious violence against Jews in the United States. Okay, so we have this situation where we know that violence against Christians is very low in India. Yet it's been reported as if it's massive because Christian missionaries in India use the State Department to complain. And then these Christian complaints are used by Islamist organizations and intellectuals who are sympathetic to the Islamist agenda to make it out as if there's going to be a Muslim genocide in India. Thus the strange bedfellows or unholy alliance aspect of the report.
You also say that organizations like the Pew Research is not technically anti-India. They don't have any bias against India. They don't have any bias against Hindus, for example, but their methodology is so bad. One is picking up these reports from US State Departments, which obviously have a tone which is more Christian missionary complaints. I don't know why they still base their reports on this. It's so obvious that this is not going to be good data for them. The other is also the way you give points, for example. If Christian missionaries in India face any violence, there is a reason for that, but they will not rate it in the same manner as they would rate, for example, any actual communal crime. You know, the fact that they look at an attack on a Christian missionary in the same way as they would look at any other violence, don't you think even that is problematic? The whole methodology is problematic.
Look, there are small problems with methodology, but I don't want to focus on those technical. There are technical problems with the methodology. But we don't have to rely on these primarily qualitative rankings based on reports of journalists and NGOs because we have hard survey data about religious freedom in India. Ironically, it comes from the same Pew Research Center, but from a different group at the Pew Research Center. And this hard survey data shows us that violence or discrimination against Muslims and Christians in India reported by actual Muslims and Christians in India is very rare. The Pew Research Center did an extraordinarily high-quality survey in 2019-2020 of 29,999 households in India. I think they wish they'd gotten just one more, 29,999. Top quality survey, more than an 85% response rate, which in survey research is unheard of. You have to really try hard to get an 85% response rate. This wasn't a telephone or a internet survey. This was knocking on doors, personally talking to people in 17 different languages, all across India. They found that 89% of Christians and 89% of Muslims say they are, quote unquote, very free to practice their religion in India. Only 2% of each group say they are unfree. Okay, so only a tiny minority of Christians and Muslims have any complaint about their ability to freely practice religion in India. So we have the hard survey data. We don't have to rely on these anecdotal reports. we can go to the numbers.
And yet the same Pew Research group doesn't look at its own data, it looks at these reports by the US State Department.
Because I think there are different motivations of different groups within Pew. Now, my instinct is, I can't know this, my instinct is that Pew actually commissioned this major quantitative study to back up its qualitative reports.
But it didn't happen.
But it didn't happen. So the Sir John Templeton Foundation, which is the foundation that funds Pew's international religious freedom efforts, they're closely linked to Christian missionary groups. And so they have a particular interest in defending missionaries abroad. That's not explicitly what they do, but they fund a lot of work that is pro-missionary, supportive of missionaries. So I think having had all of this qualitative data that they thought showed this terrible situation for Christians in India, they probably wanted to get some good hard quantitative data to back it up. But when they did the survey, they found the quantitative data don't back it up. And this survey was hardly reported. I mean, this survey was finished in 2020. Their report came out in 2021. And it's hardly been mentioned in the press. I think because it just didn't have the message.
It's not convenient, isn't it?
It wasn't the message they wanted to show. I mean, I'll give you another statistic. 24% of Indian Muslims say they face some form of discrimination on account of their religion. Now that sounds bad. Until you realize first, 72% of Indian Muslims say they've never faced discrimination on account of their religion. What's more, we can take that 24% of Indian Muslims say they've at some point in their lives faced religious discrimination and compare it to the same question asked in the United States. So the Pew Research Center, in a separate survey, asked exactly the same question with exactly the same wording in the United States, asking about racial discrimination. 80% of African Americans say they face discrimination. 46% of Hispanic Americans. 42% of Asian Americans. And only 24% of Indian Muslims. In other words, self-reported discrimination in India for Muslims and for Christians is lower than for Asian Americans. So if you want to say that Muslims and Christians are facing discrimination in India, you have to wrestle with the fact that whatever level of discrimination there is, and there certainly is some. I mean, somebody in India, is 1.4 billion people, somebody has faced discrimination. But that level of discrimination reported by the very people who are dealing with it is lower than what Indian and Chinese Americans report in the United States.
And yet it is projected like, you know, recently there have been hashtags about a genocide in India, for example, that India is so anti-Muslim that there's so much widespread violence against Muslims that they can't literally live in India without fear.
Everyone thinks that India's Muslims are on the verge of a genocide except India's Muslims.
Yeah, exactly.
India's Muslims, when asked what are the top problems you face today, number 1 is unemployment.
Exactly.
Number 2 is crime. Number 3 is corruption. Intercommunal violence is number 4. Okay, so India's own Muslims do not rate intercommunal tension
as their number 1 problem.
As their number 1, 2, or 3 problem.
No, but also, if you look at that 24% of Indian Muslims who say that they face some discrimination, I believe that data is also the same on the Hindu side. Hindu respondents, 21% of Hindu respondents have also said that they feel there is discrimination on the basis of religion. And a lot of Hindus feel that a lot of Indian laws, for example, promote minorities more than even Hindus. But I'll leave that aside. Fundamentally, the point is that a few activists, academics, are creating a narrative about India that average people, Hindus, Muslims, Christians alike in India, do not subscribe to. They are not the ones who are building this narrative. It's a handful of people.
And I always want to emphasize this with the work I've been doing on India and with my speaking to the Indian press and to Indian people. In all of this, Indian Muslims are not to blame for this narrative.
Exactly.
This is not a narrative that is coming from ordinary Indian Muslims. It may come from some Muslim politicians or Muslim leaders in India. It may come from a lot of Hindu